The air was thick with humidity and the distant crackle of gunfire. When the landing craft touched the muddy shore of Guadalcanal, Sergeant William "Will" Hayes felt the jungle breathe around him. Hot, damp and alive, with sounds that didn't belong to any civilized world. The war had brought them here, but this place belonged to something older, something wild. As his boots sank into the muck, Will scanned the line of exhausted soldiers hauling crates, their uniforms soaked and their faces pale from fever and fear. The smell of gasoline mixed with rotting vegetation. He thought of home for a brief second, the scent of pine in Ohio, the hum of his father's workshop, and then it was gone, swallowed by the stench of war. "Welcome to paradise," muttered Private Tom Riley, forcing a grin as he wiped sweat from his brow. "Paradise? Feels more like the back door to hell," replied Corporal Joe Ramirez, kicking a fuel drum half buried in mud. It clanged hollow, echoing through the trees. A few yards away, Lieutenant Harrison barked orders, his voice cutting through the heat. "Set up camp by the ridge." "Engineers report to me in 5 minutes." Will adjusted his helmet and headed toward him. He was part of the Army Corps of Engineers, builders, not killers. Yet here, under the Pacific sun, survival meant creating order from chaos. Harrison's expression was stern. "Sergeant Hayes, I need a functioning field hospital by the end of the week." Will blinked. "Sir, with respect, we've got no timber, no metal, no proper tools, just mud and those drums." "Then use the damn drums," Harrison snapped. "Command expects results. We've got wounded men coming in tomorrow." Will hesitated, glancing back at the rusted cylinders scattered like bones across the beach. Gasoline drums. Empty, dented, but strong. Still, the idea of building anything out of them felt insane. Captain Miller, the field medic, approached, his hands trembling slightly from exhaustion. "If we don't get a roof up soon, men will die of infection before the enemy even finds us." That night, Will sat by the fire, staring into the darkness. The jungle hissed and whispered, a living thing that didn't care about their mission or their courage. Somewhere beyond the trees, thunder rolled. He knew the task was impossible. But in war, impossible didn't matter. What mattered was trying. Stay with us and subscribe for more untold stories of American courage, because this one is just beginning. Morning came heavy with mist and exhaustion. The camp smelled of wet canvas and smoke, the jungle pressing in like a living wall. Sergeant Will Hayes hadn't slept. Every sound, the crack of branches, the distant cough of rifles, reminded him how far they were from anything familiar. Lieutenant Harrison's boots crunched behind him. "Sergeant," he called, sharp and cold, "that hospital isn't going to build itself." Will turned, the sweat already dripping down his neck. "Sir, we've got nothing but those empty fuel drums and a few shovels. We can't build a hospital out here in a week." Harrison's eyes narrowed. "You'll find a way. Headquarters expects results." He paused, lowering his voice. "And I expect you not to fail." Will watched him walk away, his crisp uniform spotless despite the mud. It was easy for men like Harrison to demand miracles. They didn't have to make them happen. Riley and Ramirez joined him, both carrying water cans. "He serious about that 1-week deadline?" Riley asked, wiping his face with a dirty rag. "Dead serious," Will muttered. "And we're dead if we don't figure something out." Ramirez kicked at the ground, frustration bubbling. "We're supposed to be engineers, not magicians. This place eats tools for breakfast." Before Will could answer, Captain Miller approached from the medical tent, his expression grim. "Sergeant, I've got 10 wounded men lying on the ground. No shade, no beds, no roof. If we don't get shelter, disease will finish them before the Japanese ever try." Will nodded slowly. "Understood, sir." Miller looked him in the eye. "I know it's impossible. But out here, impossible still needs doing." Then he walked off, leaving the words hanging heavy. The afternoon heat bore down like punishment. The men gathered beneath a torn tarp, their faces drawn and silent. Will traced lines in the mud with a stick, sketching and erasing ideas that made no sense. Riley tried to lighten the mood. "Back home, my dad used to say, 'When you've got nothing, son, start with that.' Guess we're about to test that theory." Will let out a tired laugh, but it faded quickly. The sound of insects filled the pause. He stared at the fuel drums again, rusted, useless, mocking him. Somewhere in his gut, a thought began to stir, faint but persistent. Not yet an answer, but the first whisper of one, and soon it would demand to be heard. The morning sun crept over the treetops, cutting through the fog that clung to the jungle like a heavy shroud. Sergeant Will Hayes stood beside a pile of dented fuel drums, his mind running in circles. Around him the men stirred, swatting mosquitoes, muttering curses, and trying to find a rhythm in the chaos. Private Tom Riley worked a knife into the lid of a drum, grinning through the sweat. "You ever seen anything tougher than this rust, Sarge? I swear it's laughing at me." "Keep talking, Riley," said Corporal Joe Ramirez, his tone dry. "Maybe the drums will feel sorry for us." The men chuckled, a brief relief in the monotony. Ramirez was from New York, sharp, cynical, but dependable when it counted. Riley, the Texan, always carried a spark of optimism that seemed to defy the jungle itself. Together, they were Will's best chance at making something out of nothing. Nearby, Private Sam Doc Walters examined a makeshift hammer fashioned from a wrench and a rock. Before the war, he'd built barns with his father in Kansas. "Give me real wood and nails," he said quietly, "and I'll give you a hospital. But this—" he gestured at the scattered drums. "This is a nightmare." Will knelt beside him, picking up one of the battered metal lids. "Nightmares still end, Doc. We just have to figure out how." The air was heavy with the buzz of insects and the faint crackle of gunfire miles away. Every sound reminded them that they were building under pressure, not just from the weather or the jungle, but from time itself. They began sorting through whatever tools they had: a few dull saws, a shovel with a cracked handle, 2 knives, and lengths of rope salvaged from cargo crates. Riley joked, "Hell, we could open a hardware store with this inventory." No one laughed. Will felt the weight of their eyes on him, expecting answers, expecting leadership. But all he could see were obstacles. The mud swallowed every step, the heat blurred his vision, and the jungle seemed to close in tighter with every breath. That night, as the men sat around a dim fire, stories of home filled the silence. Riley talked about Texas sunsets, Ramirez about city lights he'd give anything to see again. For a moment the war felt distant, but the drums waited in the dark, silent, cold, and stubborn as ever. Tomorrow they would face them again. By midday the jungle felt like a furnace. The air shimmered with heat, and every breath carried the taste of rust and sweat. The men worked knee-deep in mud that sucked at their boots, each step a struggle against the earth itself. Sergeant Will Hayes wiped the grime from his face, his shirt plastered to his back. Private Riley cursed under his breath, swatting at mosquitoes the size of bullets. "I swear these bugs are working for the enemy," he grumbled, slapping his arm. Corporal Ramirez let out a dry laugh. "If they are, they're winning the war." The sound faded quickly, swallowed by the constant hum of insects. The men's movement slowed, their energy draining under the relentless heat. Every swing of a shovel felt heavier, every thought slower. Will tried to keep them moving. "Come on, fellas. The faster we dig, the sooner we rest." Riley looked up from the mud. "Rest where, Sarge? The ground's drowning us, and the sky's trying to boil us alive." Will didn't answer. He couldn't. The weight of command pressed harder than the humidity. His men were exhausted, and the mission seemed more hopeless with every passing hour. In the distance, thunder rumbled, a storm building, though the air was already wet enough to breathe. Will's vision blurred for a moment. His knees weakened. He stumbled against a drum and caught himself, chest pounding. "Hey, you okay, Sarge?" Ramirez called out, concern cutting through the fatigue. "I'm fine," Will said, though his voice trembled. He forced himself upright, staring at the stretch of mud and metal before them. "We keep going." Later, when the men paused to drink from their canteens, Riley crouched beside Will. His tone was quieter now, almost gentle. "You don't have to carry all this alone, you know. Back home, my old man used to say, 'Even a bull needs a barn to lean on. You've got us.'" Will met his eyes, the words hitting deeper than he expected. "Thanks, Riley. Just keep the men steady. That's all I ask." The day dragged on. the jungle unrelenting. The drums gleamed dully under the fading light, mocking their struggle. As night fell, Will stared into the darkness, sweat and rain mixing on his skin. He felt small against the vastness of the jungle, but deep inside, something stubborn refused to break. Tomorrow, they would try again. The rain came without warning, thick, pounding, endless. The men scrambled to cover their supplies, but soon the camp turned into a swamp. Will Hayes sat under a half-collapsed tarp, the rain drumming on the metal barrels stacked nearby. His thoughts were heavy, tangled between exhaustion and frustration. Each drop felt like another reminder of failure. The hospital deadline was closing in, and they were no closer to a plan than the day they'd arrived. Private Riley jogged past, laughing through the downpour. "Guess we don't need a bath anymore," he shouted. His optimism, even soaked to the bone, was infuriating, and yet strangely grounding. Will looked out at the flooded clearing. The drums were everywhere, floating, rolling, clanging against each other as the water rose. One half-submerged barrel drifted toward him and struck a log, spinning in the current. He watched it bob and settle, perfectly balanced. Something clicked in his mind. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "Balanced," he whispered. The word hung there, louder than the rain. He grabbed the drum and rolled it closer, inspecting the seams, the thickness of the steel, the way it held its shape even half full of water. Riley noticed. "Are you planning to start a band, Sarge?" Will shook his head slowly. "No, I think we've been looking at these all wrong." He crouched beside the drum, running his fingers along the rim. "They're strong. Hollow, but stable. If we cut them right, maybe they could be more than containers." Ramirez approached, skeptical as always. "More than containers? They're trash, Hayes. Nothing but oil stink and rust." "Yeah," Will said, standing now, voice steady. "But trash, that can take a beating. Look around you. What else do we have that's strong, light, and already here?" Ramirez frowned. "You're serious?" "Dead serious," Will answered. "We've got a few tools and a lot of elbow grease. What if we cut them, cleaned them, and stacked them like bricks?" Riley grinned. "Oil drum walls, now that's a Texas kind of crazy." "Maybe crazy's all we've got left," Will said. For the first time in days, he felt something stir inside him, not hope yet, but direction. The sound of the rain faded into the background as his mind began to race with possibilities. He didn't know if it would work, but for the first time since landing in the jungle, he wanted to try. And that was enough to begin. By dawn, the rain had stopped, leaving behind a mist that clung to every leaf and uniform. The camp was silent except for the distant call of birds and the low hum of insects waking to the heat. Sergeant Will Hayes stood near the line of rusted fuel drums, his mind racing. He finally had an idea, but in war, ideas meant nothing until someone higher up said yes. He walked toward Lieutenant Harrison's tent, his boots sinking into the mud. The lieutenant was already awake, reading a report by lantern light, his face as sharp and unreadable as ever. "Permission to speak, sir," Will said, saluting. Harrison didn't look up. "Make it quick, Sergeant." Will took a breath. "I think I found a way to build the hospital." "Using the fuel drums," that made Harrison look up. "You want to build a medical facility out of trash?" "They're not trash, sir," Will replied. "They're metal, sturdy, hollow, light enough to move by hand. If we cut them, stack them, we can make walls, roof supports, even beds if needed." Harrison leaned back unimpressed. "You expect me to tell command we're housing wounded men inside oil cans?" Will's tone hardened. "Sir, with respect, it's not about looks. It's about saving lives. These drums are the only material we've got. Every hour we wait, men die in the mud." Silence. Harrison's jaw worked, his eyes cold but thoughtful. 3 days, he said finally. "You have 3 days to prove this works. If it doesn't, I'm shutting this operation down, and I'll personally write that you wasted manpower on a fool's errand." "Yes, sir," Will answered, standing straighter than he felt. Outside, the men were already stirring. Riley met him halfway, reading his face. "So? We've got a green light," Will said. 3 days to make it work." Ramirez whistled low. "That's not a timeline." "That's a death sentence." Will almost smiled. Then we better start building our way out of it. Riley clapped his hands. Guess it's time to see if your crazy idea floats or sinks. Will looked out over the muddy field, the rows of dented drums gleaming under the weak morning sun. His stomach twisted with both fear and determination. This was it. Either they'd make history, or they'd be buried beneath it. And the clock had just started ticking. The first strike of the hammer echoed through the jungle like a gunshot. Private Riley leaned over a fuel drum, sparks flying as he worked the edge of a heated blade into the metal. The air shimmered with heat from the small fire they'd built to burn out the gasoline residue. Smoke curled into the air, thick and bitter. Smells like hell, Ramirez muttered, coughing as he fanned the fumes away. Smells like progress, Will said, watching closely. His hands were blistered from the morning's work, his face streaked with soot. They'd spent hours cutting the first batch of drums in half, testing how they fit together, figuring out which edges could be flattened and welded with the meager tools they had. Doc Walters moved between them, eyes sharp. Don't let the flames touch the open barrels, he warned. One spark and we'll be picking shrapnel out of our hides. Riley laughed dryly. That's one way to build fast. The laughter faded when one of the drums burst with a sharp hiss, residual fuel igniting in a flash. The men dove for cover. The explosion wasn't large, but it was enough to scorch the earth and send everyone's pulse racing. "Everyone all right?" Will shouted. A few groans answered him. No one was hurt, but the near miss left the air heavy with fear. Riley stood, brushing dirt from his uniform. "Guess we found the danger part of engineering," Will exhaled, trying to steady himself. "We're learning. We just need to be smarter about it." They moved slower after that, testing each drum with care. By midday, a small pile of usable halves had formed, curved, sturdy, and lighter than Will expected. It wasn't much, but it was something tangible. Ramirez ran a hand along the edge of one piece. "Doesn't look like a wall, Sarge, looks like scrap." Will met his eyes. "Every wall starts as scrap. You just have to believe it can stand." The men worked through the afternoon, their hands raw and their tempers thin. Burns and cuts marked their skin, but they didn't stop. When night fell, Will sat by the dim glow of the coals, staring at the metal shapes laid out before him. They were crude, imperfect, but they existed. For the first time he could see it, steel becoming structure, chaos becoming purpose. But deep down, he knew the hardest part was still ahead. By morning, the smell of burnt metal lingered in the damp air. The men moved slower now, their bodies sore and blistered from the previous day's work. Still, something had shifted. The fear that once hovered over them had turned into a quiet determination. Will Hayes watched them closely. He saw exhaustion, yes, but also unity. Every man had a role now. Riley cutting, Ramirez hammering, Walters cleaning the drums with sand and boiling water. Even the younger privates had found rhythm in the noise. The jungle, once an enemy, had become their witness. As they worked, Riley began humming under his breath. At first, it was nothing more than a tune, barely audible over the clanging metal. Then Ramirez joined in, adding rough words that rhymed badly but carried heart. Before long, the camp echoed with laughter and song, off-key, irreverent, alive. Will couldn't help smiling. "Didn't take you for a choir, Ramirez." "Hey," Ramirez replied, grinning. "You try beating a drum all day and not sing something." The sound carried through the trees, defying the weight of war. Even Doc Walters chuckled. "How you boys keep that up? The Japs will think we're throwing a party." Riley winked. "Let 'em come, we'll sell tickets." The laughter was brief, but it mattered. It reminded them why they were here, not for glory, but for each other. By midday, the structure began to take shape. The first base layer of drums was laid out, the edges aligned with precision only desperation could teach. Ramirez stepped back, squinting. "I'll be damned. It actually looks like something." "Don't jinx it," Riley said. "Next thing you know, it'll fall on us." Will ran his hand over the metal, feeling its warmth from the sun. For the first time, it didn't feel like scrap. It felt like possibility. That evening, as the sky turned blood orange, Will gathered the men around the small fire. "You did good today," he said. "You took nothing and turned it into something. That's more than most men can say out here. Ramirez nodded. Guess we're more than just soldiers now. Riley smiled. We're builders. Will looked at their tired faces, streaked with sweat and soot, and felt a deep unspoken pride. The jungle roared around them, but within their small patch of mud and steel there was strength. Tomorrow they would raise the first wall. The morning broke with a grey haze, heavy and still. The jungle seemed to hold its breath as the men gathered around the foundation they'd spent days preparing. A single row of half-cut drums lay in the mud, waiting to become something more than discarded metal. Sergeant Will Hayes crouched beside them, his hands trembling slightly from fatigue. "All right," he said, his voice steady despite the exhaustion. "Let's make this thing stand." Riley grinned, holding a makeshift hammer. "You heard the man." Let's give Uncle Sam a reason to smile. They worked in silence at first, each clang of metal echoing like a heartbeat through the clearing. Mud splattered, tools slipped, and tempers flared, but no one stopped. The wall began to rise, inch by inch, the cut drums stacked tight and bound with strips of wire and rope salvaged from old supply crates. Ramirez wiped sweat from his brow, his shirt clinging to his skin. "You sure this thing won't fall on us, Sarge?" "Only one way to find out," Will replied, lifting another drum into place. His arms ached, but the rhythm of the work carried him forward. By noon the first wall stood upright, crooked, uneven but solid. For a long moment, no one spoke. The men simply stared, each of them caught between disbelief and pride. Then Riley broke the silence. "Well, I'll be damned," he said softly. "It's ugly as sin, but it's standing." A ripple of laughter spread through the group. Even Doc Walters cracked a grin. "If it keeps out the rain, it's beautiful to me." Will stepped back, studying the structure. The metal shimmered under the pale sunlight, streaked with rust and soot. It looked nothing like a hospital wall, but it was real. Something human had defied the wild, if only for a moment. He exhaled slowly, the weight in his chest easing. "This is it," he said. "This is where it starts." Riley raised a fist. "To the wall of steel and stupidity!" The men cheered, their voices echoing through the trees. For once the jungle didn't feel suffocating, it felt conquered, if only by inches. That night, as darkness fell and rain began to patter softly against the new structure, Will sat beneath it, listening to the metal hum with every drop. For the first time since the war began, he allowed himself to believe. They could actually win this. By late afternoon, the sky turned the color of bruised steel. The air grew thick, charged with the promise of something violent. Sergeant Will Hayes could feel it coming, the storm that had been building all day, waiting for the right moment to break. "Looks bad, Sarge," Riley said, glancing upward. "Real bad." Will nodded. "Tie everything down." "If this wall's gonna survive, it needs to hold tonight." The men moved fast, securing ropes around the metal drums, stacking supplies under tarps, shouting to be heard over the rising wind. Leaves tore through the air like shrapnel. The jungle, alive and restless, began to roar. Within minutes the rain came, sheets of water crashing from the heavens, pounding the ground until the mud turned to quicksand. The wall trembled. Will pressed his hands against it, feeling the vibration through the steel. "Hold, damn you," he muttered. Lightning cracked, splitting the sky wide open. A tree fell nearby, crashing down with a sound that shook the earth. The men scrambled, trying to brace the structure with whatever they could find. Ramirez shouted, "We're losing the corner." Will turned just in time to see part of the wall buckle. Riley ran forward, trying to support it, his boots slipping in the mud. "I've got it," he yelled. "Riley, get back," Will ordered, but his voice was swallowed by the storm. The wind surged, tearing one of the ropes loose. The wall lurched, and in an instant, Riley disappeared beneath it. "Riley!" Will and Ramirez rushed through the rain, heaving at the collapsed section until their muscles screamed. Together they pulled him free. Riley coughed, mud streaking his face, his leg bent awkwardly. Doc Walters knelt beside him, shouting over the storm. "It's broken, but he's alive." Will's chest heaved with both relief and fury. He looked at the half-collapsed wall, rain hammering against it. "We're not losing it," he said through clenched teeth. "We finished this fight." All night they battled the storm. Some sections held, others fell. By dawn, the rain had stopped, leaving behind silence and ruin. The wall stood, but barely. Riley lay in a makeshift cot, pale and trembling, his voice weak. "Guess the wall wanted a piece of me, huh?" Will sat beside him, exhausted. "You gave it hell first." He looked outside at the wreckage and the broken men who refused to quit. The jungle had tested them, and it wasn't finished yet. The morning after the storm was quiet, almost cruelly so. The jungle, washed clean, dripped with dew and silence. But within the camp, the air was heavy with defeat. The structure they had fought so hard to raise now stood in pieces, half buried in mud, bent and battered like the men who built it. Sergeant Will Hayes walked among the debris, his boots sinking into soft earth. Around him the soldiers moved slowly, gathering what could be salvaged. No one spoke. Even the jungle seemed to mourn. Riley lay on his cot, his legs splintered, his eyes following the others as they worked. "Hell of a housewarming party," he said, voice raspy. Will stopped beside him. "You're lucky to be here." Riley managed a grin. "Luck's just stubbornness with timing." Ramirez approached, dragging a dented drum. "We've still got material, could rebuild half of it in 2 days." He paused. "If anyone still believes it's worth it." Will didn't answer at first. He looked at the others, tired faces, bruised hands, but not broken. "It's still worth it," he said finally. "But we can't do it alone." Later that afternoon, a quiet murmur passed through the camp. From the jungle's edge emerged a group of native islanders, 3 women, 2 men, carrying woven bundles of palm leaves and long coils of vine. They didn't speak much English, but their intent was clear. One of the women offered Will a bundle, nodding. "For roof." "Dry strong." Doc Walters stepped forward, amazed. "They've been watching us." "They saw we weren't building for war," Will said. "They saw we were building to heal." The islanders worked alongside the soldiers, showing them how to weave the leaves, how to bind structures tight with natural fibers. The fusion of metal and plant seemed impossible, but it held. By sundown, the base of the hospital stood once more. This time it wasn't just American ingenuity, it was survival born of cooperation. Ramirez leaned against a drum, watching the roof go up. "Never thought I'd say this, but vines beat rope." Will smiled faintly. "Sometimes the jungle doesn't fight you. Sometimes it lends a hand." That night, as firelight danced against the rebuilt walls, the men sat quietly, not in triumph, but in quiet gratitude. They weren't finished yet, but they were no longer alone, and that made all the difference. 2 days later, the sound of engines echoed through the jungle. A convoy of jeeps and stretchers arrived, each one carrying the weight of war. Bleeding men, fevered eyes, broken bodies. The air in the camp changed. What had been a construction site was now a sanctuary. Sergeant Will Hayes stood at the entrance of the improvised hospital, his arms folded, his shirt damp with sweat. The steel walls gleamed in the morning sun, patched with palm leaves and bound with jungle vines. It didn't look like much, but it stood. Captain Miller jumped from a jeep, shouting orders. "Inside now! We've got abdominal trauma, shrapnel wounds, at least one with signs of infection. Move!" The men leapt into action. Doc Walters directed triage. Ramirez helped unload supplies. Even the islanders assisted, bringing clean water and extra leaves for bedding. One by one, the wounded were carried inside. Riley, resting nearby with his legs still bound, watched in silence. "We really did it," he murmured. Will glanced over. "We did enough to start." Inside the structure, Miller moved with intensity but no panic. He paused only once, pressing his palm against a steel wall, his eyes wide with something close to awe. "It's cooler in here," he said aloud. "Air's circulating. It's holding." Will nodded. "The drums are hollow. Air moves through them." Miller looked around. "You didn't just build shelter, you built function." Not long after, Lieutenant Harrison arrived. He stepped out of his transport, his uniform still crisp, though his expression had softened. He walked slowly through the structure, eyes scanning every joint, every wall, every makeshift solution. When he reached Will, he extended a hand. I thought this was a waste of time, Harrison admitted, but this saves lives. You've done something remarkable, Sergeant. Will took the handshake, firm but humble. We didn't have a choice, sir. That's where the best things come from. Outside, a soft wind blew through the camp, rustling the palm roofs, carrying the scent of steel and rain. The hospital wasn't perfect, but it stood. It worked. And for the wounded lying within, it meant one more day. One more chance. Will looked at his men, exhausted, scarred, proud. They had faced the impossible and met it with their hands, their minds, and their hearts. Now the fight was no longer about building. It was about healing. Night fell gently over the camp, and for the first time in weeks, the jungle sounded less like a battlefield and more like a distant memory. Crickets chirped, leaves rustled, and the steady breathing of wounded men filled the steel-walled shelter. Inside the dim glow of the hospital, Sergeant Will Hayes sat at a crate-turned writing desk, pen in hand, a half-finished letter before him. "Dear Mum, I wish I could show you what we've built here, not just the walls, but what they've come to mean." He paused, staring at the ink, then looked up at the others scattered around the shelter. Ramirez leaned against a stack of supplies, scribbling a letter of his own. "You writing to that girl back in Brooklyn?" Will asked. Ramirez smirked. "Nah, my ma. She's tougher." Riley, legs still elevated but now out of pain, sat nearby with a notebook balanced on his knee. "I'm telling my little brother we built a hospital out of gas cans. He won't believe me, but I'll make it sound like a cowboy story anyway." Doc Walters chuckled softly. "He'll think you're pulling his leg." "Hell, I still don't believe it, and I was here." The laughter was quiet, but it warmed the air. Will turned back to his letter. "We didn't have the tools, the parts, or even the right to expect success. But we had each other, and sometimes that's all it takes." Riley glanced over. "You always this poetic, Sarge?" Will smiled faintly. "Only when I'm writing to someone who believes I'm better than I am." Outside, the stars blinked above the canopy, scattered and imperfect, just like the roof of the hospital. Ramirez folded his letter, sealing it with a strip of tape. "You think this thing'll hold long-term?" Will nodded. "Maybe not forever, but long enough." Riley leaned back. "My dad used to say, build something that matters more than how long it lasts." Will sat in silence for a moment, letting those words settle. "We made something out of nothing. We made it with sweat, scars, and spit. And maybe, someday, they'll forget our names. But not what we did." He signed the letter, folded it. And for the first time in weeks, he felt something close to peace. The jungle still loomed, but tonight they had built something that reached beyond it. The morning sun cast long golden streaks across the metal walls of the jungle hospital. The wounds of the storm had healed, and now the place pulsed with life. The clatter of boots, the low murmur of patients, the occasional barked order from Captain Miller. It was a rhythm, messy but real. Word had spread. The structure had done more than survive. It had functioned. It had saved lives. When the inspection team arrived, 2 officers in polished boots and a war-weary staff sergeant, they moved through the camp like strangers in a holy place. Will Hayes stood waiting, flanked by Ramirez and Walters. His uniform was worn, stained at the collar, sleeves rolled high from work. The lead officer, Colonel Adkins, stepped inside the hospital and paused. His eyes scanned the rows of patients, the walls of cut drums, the roofing of vine and palm. He ran a hand along the curved metal, then tapped it with his knuckles. "This wasn't on any blueprint I've seen," he said. "No, sir," Will replied. But it worked. Adkins looked at Miller, who nodded. "It's cleaner than our last field hospital. Cooler, too. Less infection spread. We've been operating non-stop." The colonel walked slowly through the space, occasionally speaking to a patient. Every answer told the same story: patched up limbs, stitched wounds, second chances. Outside, Riley sat propped under a tree, leg still splinted but smile wide. He waved as the officers passed. "Tell HQ we're open for business," he called. Adkins turned back to Will. "I read the initial report: improvised construction, non-regulation materials, hazardous labor conditions. I expected a wreck." Will kept his tone steady. "So did we, sir. Until it wasn't." The colonel nodded slowly, then extended a hand. "You've set a precedent here, Sergeant, one I expect we'll be duplicating, fast." Effective. American. Will took the handshake, firm but quiet. Ramirez muttered just loud enough to hear, "Bet they forget to mention the part with the mosquitoes." That afternoon, a message was relayed back to command. New structural method successful. Recommend replication across forward positions. Credit, Sergeant William Hayes, Guadalcanal. The men didn't cheer. There was no parade. Just a few nods, a few quiet claps on the back. But in the silence there was pride, the kind that didn't shout. They hadn't done it for medals. They'd done it because no one else would. Years later, in the quiet hills of Ohio, the jungle felt like another lifetime. The air was cooler here, still and clean, and the smell of pine trees replaced the heavy rot of the Pacific. But for Sergeant William Hayes, now just Will, that distant war still lived in the lines of his hands. He stood in front of a small building, its roof curved from cut steel drums, its walls layered with repurposed scrap. Children's laughter echoed from inside. It wasn't a hospital, it was a school. Beside him, a young man in a pressed shirt held a notepad. "You say this whole place is built from surplus fuel drums?" Will nodded. "Same type we used back on Guadalcanal. Different paint, same bones." "And they held up?" "They held men's lives once. Holding up a classroom's easy after that." The reporter scribbled a note, then looked up. "So why keep using them? Why not wood or brick?" Will looked out at the hills, eyes soft. "Because people throw things away too easy. Out there in that jungle we learned that trash, if you're willing to sweat for it, can become something strong, even sacred." The young man didn't speak again, just listened. Will stepped inside the building. Light filtered through the windows, striking the metal walls with a familiar gleam. In the corner a plaque hung, old, weathered and simple. "Born from war, built for peace." Years hadn't dulled the memory. He could still feel the sting of sweat, the weight of wet steel, the voices of Riley, Ramirez, Walters, all of them. Some had made it home, some hadn't. But what they built had outlived the bullets. In the back of the room, a girl raised her hand and asked the teacher, "Why are the walls shiny?" The teacher smiled. "Because they used to be something else, and someone saw more in them." Outside, Will sat on a bench beneath a tall oak, hands folded, eyes watching the wind play with fallen leaves. He never asked for recognition. The world moved on, as it always does. But in quiet corners, rural schools, backroad clinics, storm shelters made from drums, pieces of their story still stood. Steel, sweat, and something more. If stories like this move you, if you believe in what can rise from nothing but courage and grit, subscribe to the channel and keep walking with us. The next story is just ahead.